Hello, I am David Leo and this is my Warrior of Light. Final Fantasy XIV plans to continue for at least another 10 years. During those next 10 years we know we will get more story, more dungeons, and more glamour pieces. But I think one of the most important pieces of content that the player base looks forward to, including myself, are new jobs, also known as classes in other role-playing games. From Heaven's Ward to Endwalker we had received 9 new playable jobs. We cannot make any guarantees that we will receive another 9 jobs in these next 10 years. But we can still make educated guesses as to what those new classes could be, since they take inspiration from past Final Fantasy games. I'll admit that I do not have 9 guesses at this moment, so I'll be making 4 guesses for this video. Also, throughout this video I go back and forth between saying jobs and classes. Otherwise, I am referring to the same thing. The Berserker seems to be a common request from the community. I also fall into this camp, and I am optimistic enough to believe that we may see the Berserker as early as the next expansion. The Berserker made its debut in Final Fantasy V where it has a high attack stat and stamina. This combination alone would make it an ideal candidate for the tank role in FF14. The demand for Berserker comes from the community's desire to see a hammer-wielding class, which the Berserker does in Final Fantasy V. If not a hammer, it can use axes and can also act as a second branch to the Marauder. Similar to how the Arcanist can become either a summoner or scholar. One of Berserker's defining traits in Final Fantasy V is that you cannot control them. It is programmed to only attack the nearest enemy. Despite this downside, the Berserker is able to ignore the enemy's defense stat up to a certain percentage. The Berserker class technically make a return in Final Fantasy VI with the character Amaro, a club-wielding yeti with high physical damage and can cast ice magic. Amaro can even heal when ice magic is being casted against him. Might not fit the Berserker theme but it can give the job a bit more flavor. The Berserker class would make its official return in Final Fantasy X too, once again acting as a tanky frontliner. In X2 the ability Howl was introduced, a buff that doubles the Berserker's max HP. Berserker would also get a series of offensive abilities called Instinct in X2. Most of these involve dealing an instance of damage followed by applying a debuff for additional utility. This utility varies from applying poison, slow, or reducing the enemy's max HP. The Berserker had a notable entry in Final Fantasy Tactics Advance 2, where it was more of a monk class. In Tactics Advance 2, the Berserker is capable of breaking the enemy's armor, which can be seen as reducing the enemy's defensive stats. But the Berserker was also able to raise its own critical hit rate. More crits equals more damage. Berserker's identity revolves around its high damage and health stat while also applying the occasional status effects. If implemented into Final Fantasy XIV, it may end up becoming a tank DPS hybrid similar to the Gunbreaker, but I personally would be okay with that. Gambler is the job that I want to see the most in FF14, but strangely the Gambler is not an official job in the Final Fantasy series. The only true Gambler that Final Fantasy has is Setzer from Final Fantasy VI. Setzer, in FF6, is capable of dealing both physical and magic damage while wielding cards, darts, and dice for weapons. The Gambler would be a range DPS job, but the question is, range physical or caster? I would not be surprised if there was an attempt to make the Gambler fit both roles in an attempt to do something different. Setzer and many other Final Fantasy characters after him would have abilities tied to a casino slot minigame. But this seems to be the limit when it comes to a gambling class. meaning that inspiration would need to be taken elsewhere. 3 examples come to mind. The Trickster from Final Fantasy Tactics Advance 2, Luke Sword from the Kingdom Hearts series, and Ace from Final Fantasy Type 0. Let's start with what I consider to be the outlier of these 3, Luke Sword. Luke Sword's boss fights have abilities where he can teleport, create walls of cards to form a barrier, and grant himself immunity to all sources of damage by transforming himself into a card. If the Gambler was to be a support DPS job, similar to the Dancer, then abilities such as these could be a start. Although I will admit that a non-tank class granting themselves or a teammate's damage immunity may seem overtuned. The Trickster from is all about range damage while inflicting status effects such as Poison, Charm, Frog, and Berserker. Realistically, most of these status effects won't go into use. Turning any of the raid bosses into a frog for a few seconds seems too overpowered, if not funny. Instead, these abilities could be reworked into damage over time effects and reducing enemy stats. And then there is Ace, who I think should be the main source of inspiration for a Gambler job. Final Fantasy Type 0, Ace is a mage archetype while having high mobility. Ace's dash is a short teleport. His standard attack is throwing cards just as Setzer and the Tricker do the same. However, Ace's main ability is a card system similar to the Astrologian. You draw a certain number of cards and depending on the card's color you will get a different effect. I understand that having a second job revolving around an RNG card system seems redundant. But it could also be a gateway for Astrologian mains to transition into the DPS role, and vice versa. The Green Mage from Final Fantasy Tactics Advance 2 would be the second candidate for a hammer-wielding job after the Berserker. Despite being able to use a hammer in combat, their actual abilities do not support an aggressive playstyle. The Green Mage's green magic is oriented around boosting your team's stats while applying status effects on your enemies. The only other notable abilities are for defensive utility. Magic Evade is a misleading title as it functions to grant resistance to magic damage. And Absorb MP allows you to regain MP when taking magic damage. On paper I like these 2 abilities, but I'd imagine in execution they'd be incredibly niche. If the Green Mage were to be added to FF14 then it would receive a new rendition. A similar treatment to what was done for the Sage. For those who don't know, the Sage in past Final Fantasy entries was able to use both black and white magic similar to the Red Mage. But the Sage was given a new identity for FF14, a healer with some science fiction elements. I could imagine the Green Mage being reworked into a tank, or a healer with pseudo-tank properties. Something that would justify a wizard wielding a hammer, as silly as that sounds. This job goes by many names in the Final Fantasy series: Mystic Knight, Spellblade, and Rune Fencer. Doing research for this video, I found that the Rune Fencer is a tank job in FF11. And I am curious as to why it was not brought back for FF14. The Mystic Knight is a very straightforward class. It makes melee attacks infused with elemental properties including fire, blizzard, thunder, and more. The Rune Fencer in FF11 has these kinds of offensive abilities along with the Regen spell. After all, the tanks in FF14 have some form of sustain. I don't think there's too much to say since the Rune Fencer already lays the basis for a Mystic Knight in FF14. They can keep the Rune Fencer name if they want. I'm just lost in thought as to how we went so long without this job. And those are my predictions for new jobs in Final Fantasy XIV. Is there a different class you want to see? If so, I might make a second video on it. Thank you for watching and I hope to see you again soon.